Imagine walking into a grocery store, expecting nothing out of the ordinary, and in a matter of minutes, your entire world is turned upside down. That's exactly what happened to Lucas. One small act of kindness, helping an elderly woman with her groceries, set off a chain of events he never could have predicted. But as their bond grew, so did the mysteries surrounding her past, leading Lucas down a path of emotions he never knew existed. This is not just a story about a young man helping someone in need. It's about the unexpected connections we make in life, the secrets that bind us, and the heart-wrenching decisions we face when we discover the truth. Lucas's life was never the same after that day, and neither will yours after hearing what happened next. Could you ever imagine falling in love with someone whose past could destroy everything you thought you knew? The fluorescent lights of Walmart buzzed overhead as Lucas Thompson, a 23-year-old aspiring filmmaker, absent-mindedly pushed his shopping cart down the frozen foods aisle. It was a typical Friday evening in Burlington, Vermont, and the store was bustling with weekend shoppers. Lucas's mind wandered to his latest project, a documentary about the opioid crisis that had devastated so many families in his community. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the elderly woman struggling with her cart just ahead. Crash! The sound of metal colliding and groceries tumbling to the floor snapped Lucas back to reality. His cart had slammed into the woman's, sending her carefully selected items sprawling across the linoleum. "Oh my God! I'm so sorry!" Lucas exclaimed, his face flushing with embarrassment. He immediately knelt down to help, expecting anger or frustration from the woman he'd inconvenienced. Instead, he looked up to see a pair of striking blue eyes gazing at him with surprising warmth. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 70s, had silver hair styled in an elegant bob and wore a well-tailored tweed jacket despite the summer heat. "No harm done, young man," she said, her voice rich and melodious. "Accidents happen." As Lucas scrambled to gather her groceries, he couldn't help but notice the items she'd selected: organic produce, a small bottle of expensive bourbon, and several packages of gourmet cat food. This was no ordinary retiree. "I'm Lucas," he said, handing her a bruised apple with an apologetic smile. "Please, let me help you finish your shopping. It's the least I can do." The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "That's very kind of you, Lucas. I'm Helena." As they made their way through the store, Lucas found himself captivated by Helena's presence. She moved with a grace that belied her years, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor. They fell into easy conversation, discussing everything from the weather to local politics. "So, what brings a young man like you to the grocery store on a Friday night?" Helena asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Shouldn't you be out with friends, enjoying your youth?" Lucas chuckled, running a hand through his unruly brown hair. "Honestly, I'm working on a film project. It's about the opioid crisis here in Vermont. I guess I've been so focused on it that I forgot to have a social life." Helena's expression softened. "That's a heavy topic for someone your age, but an important one. My late husband was a doctor. He saw firsthand how addiction can tear families apart." There was a flicker of something in Helena's eyes as she spoke, a deep sadness that made Lucas's heart ache. He felt an inexplicable urge to comfort her, to learn more about the story behind that pain. As they approached the checkout, Lucas insisted on helping Helena with her bags. "Where do you live?" he asked. "I'd be happy to give you a ride home." Helena hesitated again, studying Lucas's face intently. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded. "That would be lovely, thank you." The drive to Helena's home was short but memorable. She lived in a charming Victorian house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. As they chatted, Lucas learned that Helena was a retired literature professor who now spent her days writing mystery novels and caring for her 3 cats. "Hemingway, Austen, and Poe," she said with a laugh, referring to her feline companions. "They're quite the literary bunch." As Lucas carried Helena's groceries to her front porch, he felt a strange reluctance to leave. There was something about this woman, her wit, her kindness, the hint of mystery in her past, that drew him in like a moth to a flame. "Thank you again, Lucas," Helena said, her blue eyes twinkling in the porch light. "You've made an old woman's evening much brighter." Lucas felt his cheeks grow warm. "It was my pleasure, really. I hope this isn't too forward, but would it be all right if I stopped by again sometime? Maybe we could have tea, and you could tell me more about your writing." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and Lucas immediately felt foolish. Why would this fascinating woman want to spend time with someone half a century her junior? But to his surprise, Helena's face lit up with a radiant smile. "I'd like that very much, Lucas. How about next Saturday afternoon?" As Lucas walked back to his car, he felt a surge of excitement he couldn't quite explain. He turned to wave goodbye and caught a glimpse of Helena through her front window. For a moment, she looked impossibly young and beautiful, bathed in the warm glow of her living room lamp. Then she disappeared from view, leaving Lucas with a strange ache in his chest. Driving home, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. He'd gone to the store for milk and bread, but left with a connection that felt deeper than any he'd experienced in years. Helena's stories, her laughter, the sadness lurking behind her eyes. It all swirled in his mind, igniting his imagination and stirring emotions he didn't fully understand. As he climbed the stairs to his small apartment, Lucas's phone buzzed with texts from friends inviting him out for drinks. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel the familiar pang of loneliness. Instead, his mind was already racing ahead to next Saturday, wondering what new discoveries awaited him in Helena's charming Victorian home. Lucas fell asleep that night with a smile on his face, unaware that his chance encounter in the grocery store had set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The story that was about to unfold was one of unexpected love, painful secrets, and the power of human connection to heal even the deepest wounds. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Lucas dreamed of kind blue eyes and the gentle voice of a woman who seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Little did he know, the simple act of helping with groceries had opened the door to a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the ties that bind us across generations. As the Vermont summer sun streamed through the windows of his cramped apartment, Lucas found himself counting down the days until Saturday. The memory of Helena's twinkling blue eyes and enigmatic smile haunted his thoughts, distracting him from his documentary work and leaving him restless with anticipation. When Saturday finally arrived, Lucas spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing his outfit and styling his unruly hair. He felt ridiculous. She was old enough to be his grandmother, for heaven's sake. But he couldn't shake the desire to impress her. Clutching a bouquet of wildflowers he'd impulsively purchased from a street vendor, Lucas approached Helena's Victorian home. The house seemed to glow in the afternoon light, its gingerbread trim and stained glass windows hinting at a storied past. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing Helena. She wore a flowing silk blouse that accentuated her still graceful figure, and her silver hair gleamed in the sunlight. "Lucas, right on time," she greeted him warmly. Her eyes fell on the flowers, and a soft smile played across her lips. "How thoughtful. Come in, come in." As Lucas stepped inside, he was immediately enveloped by the rich scent of old books and freshly baked scones. Helena's home was a treasure trove of antiques and curiosities, shelves lined with leather-bound tomes, walls adorned with black and white photographs, and display cases filled with what looked like artifacts from around the world. "Wow," Lucas breathed, taking it all in. "Your house is like a museum," Helena chuckled, leading him to a cozy sitting room. "More like the collection of a life well-traveled. Please make yourself comfortable. I'll fetch the tea." As Helena busied herself in the kitchen, Lucas found himself drawn to a large photograph above the fireplace. It showed a much younger Helena, radiant in a white dress, standing beside a handsome man in a military uniform. They both looked blissfully happy, their entire lives stretching before them. "That was taken the day before James shipped out to Vietnam." Helena's voice came softly from behind him. She handed Lucas a delicate china teacup, her eyes misty with remembrance. "We'd only been married 3 months." Lucas felt a pang in his chest. Did he? He couldn't bring himself to finish the question. Helena shook her head. He came home, but the war, it changed him. Changed us both, I suppose. She sighed, gesturing for Lucas to sit. But enough about ancient history. Tell me, how is your documentary coming along? As they sipped tea and nibbled on homemade scones, Lucas found himself opening up to Helena in a way he never had with anyone before. He shared his passion for filmmaking, his fears about doing justice to such a sensitive topic, and his own family's brush with addiction. My cousin overdosed when I was in high school, Lucas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. He was like a brother to me. I guess that's why this project means so much. Helena reached out, her warm hand covering his. Oh, my dear boy, I'm so sorry. The compassion in her eyes was almost overwhelming. You're carrying quite a burden for someone so young. Something about Helena's gentle presence broke down Lucas's carefully constructed walls. Before he knew it, tears were streaming down his face as he poured out years of pent-up grief and guilt. Helena listened without judgment, offering comfort and occasional nuggets of hard-won wisdom. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Lucas felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I'm sorry, he said, wiping his eyes with embarrassment. I didn't mean to dump all of that on you. Helena's laugh was like wind chimes in a summer breeze. Don't apologize for being human, Lucas. We all need someone to listen sometimes. She stood, stretching slightly. Now, how about I show you my writing nook? I have a feeling you might appreciate it. Lucas followed Helena up a narrow staircase to a small turret room with windows overlooking the neighborhood. An antique desk sat in the center, covered in papers and surrounded by overflowing bookshelves. This is where the magic happens, Helena said with a wink. Or where I stare out the window and pretend to be productive, at least. As Helena showed him her current manuscript, a mystery set in 1920s New Orleans, Lucas found himself captivated not just by the story, but by the passion with which she spoke about her characters. Her eyes lit up, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described plot twists and red herrings. You're amazing, Lucas blurted out, immediately blushing at his own forwardness. I mean, your writing. It's really impressive. Helena's smile was both pleased and slightly sad. Thank you, dear. It's nice to have someone to share it with again. Since James passed, well, the house can get a bit quiet. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, Lucas realized with a start how much time had passed. I should probably get going, he said reluctantly. I have an early interview tomorrow for the documentary. Helena nodded, but Lucas could have sworn he saw a flicker of disappointment cross her face. Of course, don't let me keep you. At the front door, Lucas hesitated. Helena, would it be all right if I came by again sometime? Maybe next weekend? The smile that bloomed on Helena's face was radiant. I'd like that very much, Lucas. Perhaps you could even bring some of your footage to show me? As Lucas walked to his car, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. He turned back to wave goodbye and saw Helena framed in the doorway, the light from inside creating a soft halo around her silver hair. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Lucas was struck by how elegant and beautiful Helena looked, not in spite of her age, but because of it. She carried herself with a grace and confidence that spoke of a life fully lived. Driving home, Lucas's mind was a whirl with conflicting emotions. He felt a connection to Helena that was unlike anything he'd experienced before. It wasn't romantic, or at least he didn't think it was, but it was deep and powerful nonetheless. He thought of the sadness in her eyes when she spoke of her late husband, the passion in her voice as she described her writing, the gentle way she'd comforted him during his breakdown. Helena was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and he found himself craving more of her company, her wisdom, her stories. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Lucas's phone buzzed with a text from his best friend, inviting him out for drinks. But for once, the idea of hanging out at a noisy bar held no appeal. Instead, he found himself looking forward to a quiet evening of working on his documentary, inspired by his conversations with Helena. Lucas fell asleep that night with a smile on his face, his dreams filled with images of a Victorian house, the scent of old books, and the sound of Helena's melodious laughter. He had no way of knowing that his growing connection to this remarkable woman was about to lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the secrets that bind us all. The lazy days of late summer in Burlington had given way to the crisp air and vibrant foliage of autumn. Over the past few months, Lucas's visits to Helena's Victorian home had become a cherished weekly ritual. Each Saturday afternoon, he would arrive with a small token, a bunch of flowers, a rare book he'd found at a second-hand store, or a sample of his latest documentary footage, and leave feeling enriched by Helena's wisdom and warmth. On this particular October day, the maple trees lining Helena's street were ablaze with color, their leaves a symphony of red and gold. Lucas knocked on the familiar door, a pumpkin spice latte in each hand, a concession to the season that had made Helena roll her eyes but secretly delighted her. "Lucas, dear boy." Helena greeted him with her usual enthusiasm. But as she ushered him inside, Lucas noticed a slight tremor in her hands, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Is everything all right, Helena?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. She waved off his worry with a forced smile. "Just a touch of arthritis acting up. Nothing to fuss over." They settled into their usual spots in the cozy living room, surrounded by the comforting clutter of Helena's well-lived life. As they sipped their lattes, Lucas regaled her with stories from his latest interviews for the documentary. He was in the final stages now, piecing together the narrative that would hopefully shed light on the opioid crisis gripping their community. "I spoke with this woman, Sarah," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "She lost her son to an overdose last year. The way she described him as a little boy, so full of life and promise. God, Helena, it just broke my heart." Helena reached out, patting his hand gently. "You have such compassion, Lucas. It's what will make your film truly impactful." As she spoke, Helena's sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a faded tattoo on her inner wrist. Lucas had never noticed it before, a small, stylized lotus flower. "I didn't know you had a tattoo," he said, curiosity piqued. Helena's face changed, a shadow passing over her features. She tugged her sleeve down quickly, but not before Lucas caught a glimpse of what looked like a series of numbers beneath the flower. "Helena?" he pressed gently. "What is it?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, Lucas. Something I should have told you long ago." The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken tension. Helena took a deep breath, her blue eyes meeting Lucas's with an intensity that made his heart race. "The story I told you about my husband, James, it wasn't entirely true." Helena's voice quavered. "He did go to Vietnam, but he never came home." Lucas felt a jolt of confusion. "But I thought you said." Helena held up a hand, silencing him. "Please let me finish. It's time you knew the truth." With trembling fingers, Helena rolled up her sleeve fully, revealing the tattoo in its entirety. The lotus flower, Lucas now saw, was not decorative but a cover-up, only partially obscuring a series of faded numbers underneath. "I was born in Warsaw," Helena began, her voice taking on a distant quality. "In 1930, when the Nazis invaded Poland, my family—" Her voice broke, and Lucas instinctively reached for her hand, offering silent support. "I was just a child when they took us to Auschwitz," Helena continued, her eyes glazed with unshed tears. "This number, it's all that's left of the girl I was before." Lucas felt as though the ground had opened up beneath him. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the Helena he knew, vibrant, passionate, full of life, with the horrors she was describing. "After the war, I came to America. I was alone, afraid, but determined to build a new life," Helena said. "I met a kind man named David. We married, had a son." Her voice trailed off, pain etching deep lines around her mouth. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. There was something in Helena's tone, a weight to her words that hinted at an even deeper revelation to come. "Helena," he said softly, Why are you telling me this now? She looked at him then, really looked at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. Because, Lucas, that son was your father. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lucas felt as though he'd been plunged into icy water, unable to breathe, unable to think. What? He managed to choke out. But that's impossible. My grandparents, they were the people who raised your father. Helena finished for him, her voice gentle but firm. I gave him up for adoption when he was just a baby. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I wasn't well, Lucas. The trauma of what I'd been through, it was too much. I couldn't be the mother he deserved. Lucas stood abruptly, his mind spinning. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. All this time, all these months of growing closer to Helena, of feeling this inexplicable connection. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, a mix of anger and confusion coloring his voice. All this time, you knew who I was, and you said nothing? Helena's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid, Lucas. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of dredging up a past I've spent a lifetime trying to forget. But I see now. Keeping this secret has only caused more pain. Lucas sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The room was silent save for the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the soft sound of Helena's muffled sobs. When he finally looked up, Lucas saw Helena as if for the first time. The lines on her face, the sorrow in her eyes, they spoke of a lifetime of pain and loss he could scarcely imagine. But there was strength there too, and a love so fierce it took his breath away. I'm so sorry, Lucas, Helena whispered. I know this changes everything. If you want to leave and never come back, I'll understand. But please know, getting to know you these past months has been the greatest joy of my life. Lucas felt tears streaming down his own cheeks now. His emotions were a tangled mess, shock, anger, confusion, and underneath it all, a love for this woman that he couldn't deny, regardless of the bombshell she just dropped. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady. Helena watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. I need some time, Lucas said, his voice hoarse, to process all of this. It's a lot. Helena nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course, take all the time you need. As Lucas made his way to the door, he paused, turning back to look at the woman who had become so dear to him, the woman who, he now knew, was his grandmother. Helena, he said softly, I don't know what this means for us, but thank you for telling me the truth. With that, he stepped out into the crisp autumn air, leaving Helena alone in the house that suddenly felt far too big and far too empty. As the door closed behind him, Lucas leaned against it, his heart pounding. He had come to Helena's house that day as a friend, maybe even as someone falling in love. He left as a grandson, his world turned upside down, facing a future he could never have imagined. As he walked to his car, the golden leaves crunching beneath his feet, Lucas felt as though he were walking into a new chapter of his life, one filled with uncertainty, pain, and the potential for a love deeper than he'd ever known. The Burlington sky was a gloomy gray, mirroring Lucas's tumultuous state of mind as he trudged through Ethan Allen Park. It had been 5 days since Helena's earth-shattering revelation, and he felt no closer to making sense of it all. The chilly November wind whipped through the bare trees, carrying with it the scent of impending snow. Lucas found a secluded bench overlooking the Winooski River and sank down, his body heavy with the weight of conflicting emotions. He pulled out his phone, staring at the dozen missed calls and unread text messages from Helena. Each one was a plea for understanding, for a chance to explain further. He couldn't bring himself to respond. As he sat there, memories of the past few months with Helena flooded his mind. The warmth of her smile, the wisdom in her eyes, the way she listened to him like no one ever had before. He thought of the growing feelings he'd been struggling with, feelings that now filled him with a confusing mix of shame and longing. What the hell is wrong with me? Lucas muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. A jogger passed by, giving him a concerned look. Lucas realized he must look a mess, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd had on for days. He thought back to the moment everything changed, replaying Helena's words in his mind. "That son was your father." The sentence echoed, taunting him with its implications. His entire understanding of his family history had been upended in an instant. Lucas pulled out his laptop, opening the video editing software where his nearly completed documentary waited. He stared at the timeline, filled with interviews of families torn apart by addiction and loss. Suddenly, his own story felt like it belonged among them, a tale of generational trauma and hidden truths. As he sat there, a memory surfaced of something Helena had said during one of their early meetings. She had been talking about her writing, about the importance of understanding characters' motivations. "Everyone has reasons for the choices they make, Lucas," she had said, her eyes distant. "Even when those choices hurt the people they love most. Sometimes, especially then." At the time, he had thought she was simply sharing writing advice. Now, he wondered if she had been trying to prepare him, in her own way, for the truth she knew she would eventually have to reveal. Lucas closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it must have been like for Helena. A young woman, scarred by unimaginable horrors, trying to build a new life in a strange country. The weight of her past bearing down on her, making it impossible to be the mother she wanted to be. For the first time since that fateful afternoon, Lucas felt a flicker of empathy pushing through his anger and confusion. He thought of his own struggles with depression in college, how there were days when just getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable task. If he had been responsible for a child in that state, "God," he whispered, his throat tight, "what am I supposed to do?" As if in answer, his phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from his mother, asking if he was still coming to Sunday dinner. Lucas stared at the screen, a new wave of anxiety washing over him. His parents, the people who had raised him, loved him unconditionally. Did they know the truth? Had they been keeping this secret from him his entire life? The thought sent a fresh surge of anger through him. He stood abruptly, pacing along the riverbank. Part of him wanted to confront his parents immediately, to demand answers. Another part wanted to run away, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But as the last light of day faded from the sky, Lucas knew he couldn't hide from this forever. He had spent months working on a documentary about the destructive power of secrets and the importance of facing hard truths. How could he preach that message to others if he wasn't willing to confront the painful reality of his own life? With shaking hands, Lucas pulled out his phone and dialed Helena's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to lose his nerve, her voice came through the speaker, soft and hesitant. "Lucas? Is that you?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Yeah, it's me. I think we need to talk. Really talk." He could hear the relief in Helena's voice, mixed with trepidation. "Of course, whenever you're ready." Lucas looked out over the darkening river, watching the first snowflakes of the season begin to fall. "How about tomorrow? There's a lot I need to understand." As he ended the call, Lucas felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. He knew the conversation ahead would be difficult, painful even. But for the first time in days, he also felt a glimmer of hope. Walking back to his car, Lucas's mind raced with questions. About his father, about the grandparents who had raised him, about the complex web of love and loss that had shaped his family long before he was born. But mostly, he thought about Helena, the woman he had come to care for so deeply, in ways he was only now beginning to fully comprehend. As he drove home through the quiet streets of Burlington, the first real snow of winter blanketing the city in white, Lucas knew that tomorrow would be a turning point. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation or a final parting, it would change the course of his life forever. He fell into a fitful sleep that night, his dreams a confused tangle of concentration camp tattoos, pumpkin spice lattes, and the sound of Helena's laughter echoing through the halls of her Victorian home. When he woke, it was with a sense of resolution. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The morning dawned crisp and clear, The world outside Lucas's apartment window transformed into a winter wonderland overnight. As he stood at the kitchen counter, clutching a mug of strong black coffee, Lucas steeled himself for the day ahead. He had hardly slept, his mind churning with questions he both dreaded and needed to ask. Before he could face Helena, there was one stop he had to make. With a deep breath, Lucas grabbed his keys and headed out into the snow-covered streets of Burlington. 20 minutes later, he found himself standing on the front porch of his childhood home, his hand poised to knock. Through the frosted glass, he could see the warm glow of the kitchen light and the familiar silhouette of his mother moving about inside. The door opened before he could knock, his mother's face lighting up with surprise and joy. "Lucas, what are you doing here so early? Come in, you must be freezing." As he stepped into the warmth of the house, the scent of cinnamon and coffee enveloping him, Lucas felt a lump form in his throat. How many secrets lay buried beneath this cozy domesticity? "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about my real grandmother." The color drained from his mother's face. She stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady herself against the kitchen counter. "Oh, Lucas," she breathed. "How did you—" "Helena told me," he said, watching as recognition and then understanding dawned in his mother's eyes. "She told me everything." What followed was a conversation unlike any Lucas had ever had with his parents. His father joined them, called down from his home office by the urgent tone in his wife's voice. Together, they unraveled the complex tapestry of lies and half-truths that had shaped their family for decades. "We always planned to tell you," his father said, his voice heavy with regret. "But as the years went by, it never seemed like the right time." Lucas learned that his father had always known he was adopted, had even met Helena briefly when he turned 18. But the reunion had been painful, awkward, and they had both chosen to keep their distance afterward. "She was so broken, Lucas," his mother said softly. "The weight of her past. It was too much for her to bear. Your father felt it was better to let sleeping dogs lie, to protect you from that pain." As the morning wore on, Lucas felt his anger slowly giving way to a profound sadness. He saw the tears in his parents' eyes, the genuine remorse in their voices. They had made mistakes, yes, but out of love, a misguided attempt to shield him from the harsh realities of their family history. When he finally left his parents' house, the winter sun high in the sky, Lucas felt both drained and oddly lightened. The truth, as painful as it was, had begun to lift the fog of confusion that had clouded his mind for days. With a heavy heart but a clearer head, Lucas made his way to Helena's Victorian home. The Christmas wreath on her door seemed almost garishly cheerful given the gravity of the moment. Helena answered his knock immediately, as if she had been waiting by the door. The sight of her, smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered, nearly broke Lucas's resolve. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. "There's so much we need to discuss." In Helena's cozy living room, surrounded by the artifacts of her long and complicated life, Lucas finally heard the full story. Helena spoke for hours, her voice sometimes strong, sometimes faltering, as she recounted the horrors of her youth in Auschwitz, the struggle to build a new life in America, and the crippling depression that had led her to give up her only child. "I thought I was protecting him," Helena said, tears streaming down her lined face. "I thought he deserved better than a broken mother who couldn't escape the ghosts of her past. But not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted that decision." Lucas listened, his heart aching for the young woman Helena had been, for the father he had never truly known, for the family that could have been. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the room, Helena turned to Lucas with a look of desperate hope. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," she said, "but is there any chance you could find it in your heart to forgive me? To perhaps allow me to be a part of your life in whatever way you're comfortable with?" Lucas sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of history and family and love pressing down on him. He thought of the connection he had felt with Helena from the very beginning, the way she had listened to him, supported him, believed in him. He thought of the pain she had carried for so many years, the courage it must have taken to finally reveal the truth. Finally, he reached out and took Helena's hand in his own. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I do know that I'm not ready to lose you from my life. We've both been given a second chance here. Maybe we can try to make the most of it." The smile that bloomed on Helena's tear-stained face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. She squeezed Lucas's hand, her blue eyes shining with gratitude and hope. As Lucas left Helena's house that evening, the snow crunching beneath his feet, he felt as though he were walking into a new chapter of his life. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trusts to rebuild. But for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of excitement for what the future might hold. He pulled out his phone, opening the video editing software for his documentary. With a sudden burst of inspiration, he began to type out a new narrative, one that incorporated his own family's story of trauma, secrets, and the healing power of truth. As he walked through the quiet, snow-covered streets of Burlington, Lucas realized that his journey with Helena was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks following Lucas's confrontation with Helena and his parents passed in a blur of emotional upheaval and cautious reconciliation. As Christmas approached, bringing with it a fresh blanket of snow and the cheerful bustle of holiday preparations in Burlington, Lucas found himself standing once again on Helena's front porch, a beautifully wrapped gift in his hands and a storm of conflicting emotions in his heart. He had been visiting Helena regularly, their relationship evolving into something new and fragile. Gone was the easy camaraderie of their earlier encounters, replaced by a more complex dynamic as they navigated their newfound familial connection. Yet underneath it all, Lucas could still feel the pull of the deep bond they had formed over those initial months. Helena opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Lucas, come in, come in. I was just about to make some hot cocoa." As he stepped inside, the warm scent of cinnamon and pine enveloped him. Helena had decorated for the holidays, and the Victorian home looked like something out of a Dickens novel. A massive Christmas tree dominated the living room, its branches heavy with antique ornaments that surely held decades of memories. "I hope you don't mind," Helena said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I know we hadn't discussed plans, but I thought, well, I hoped you might join me for Christmas Eve dinner tomorrow. Just the two of us." Lucas felt a pang in his chest. He had already promised his parents he would spend Christmas Eve with them, a tradition that now felt weighted with new meaning and expectation. I'm not sure I can," he began, watching as disappointment flickered across Helena's face. "My parents, they're expecting me." Helena nodded quickly, forcing a smile. Of course. I should have realized. It's no matter, truly." But Lucas could see the hurt in her eyes, and it twisted something inside him. He thought of Helena spending Christmas alone, surrounded by memories and regrets. Before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "What if I came by in the afternoon? We could have an early dinner, and then I could still make it to my parents' place for the evening." The joy that lit up Helena's face was almost painful to behold. "Oh, Lucas, that would be wonderful. I'll cook all your favorites. Or, well, what I've learned are your favorites these past months." As they settled in the living room with mugs of rich hot cocoa, Lucas found himself studying Helena. She looked happier than he had seen her in weeks, almost glowing with excitement as she chattered about her plans for their Christmas Eve meal. And yet, there was still a frailty to her that tugged at his heart. "Helena," he said softly, interrupting her mid-sentence, Are you doing okay? With all of this, She paused, her blue eyes meeting his with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. "Oh, my dear boy," she sighed. "I won't pretend it's been easy. There are days when the weight of the past feels almost unbearable. But having you in my life, even in this complicated way, it's more than I ever dared hope for." Lucas nodded, understanding all too well the complexity of their situation. He thought of the documentary he was still editing, of the families torn apart by addiction and the long, painful road to healing. In many ways, his own family's story wasn't so different. As the afternoon wore on, Lucas found himself relaxing into the familiar comfort of Helena's presence. They talked about his documentary, about her latest writing project, about the books they had both read recently. It was almost like old times, and yet, there was a moment, as Helena laughed at something he said, her eyes crinkling at the corners, when Lucas felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of affection. It was different from before, not the confusing romantic feelings he had been grappling with, but something deeper, more primal. He saw in her face echoes of his own, recognized gestures and expressions that must have been passed down through generations. And in that moment, Lucas realized he was facing a new dilemma. He had come to terms with Helena as his grandmother, had begun to forge a new relationship built on honesty and shared history. But a part of him still mourned the loss of what they had been before: confidants, kindred spirits, two souls connecting across generations. As he prepared to leave, promising to return the next day for their Christmas Eve dinner, Lucas felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. He knew the coming holiday would be a minefield of emotions: guilt over dividing his time, anxiety about his parents' reactions, the ever-present undercurrent of unresolved feelings. Standing in the doorway, Helena reached up to adjust his scarf, her touch achingly maternal. "Thank you, Lucas," she said softly, "for giving me a chance, for being willing to create new memories, even with all the baggage of the past." Lucas felt his throat tighten. On impulse, he leaned down and kissed her cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "Merry Christmas, Helena," he whispered, as he walked to his car, the snow crunching beneath his feet and the winter wind nipping at his face. Lucas felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emotions to navigate. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope that perhaps, out of all this pain and confusion, something beautiful and healing might yet emerge. The lights of Burlington twinkled around him as he drove home, his mind already racing with thoughts of the day to come. Whatever happened, Lucas knew that this Christmas would be unlike any he had ever experienced before, a bittersweet blend of old traditions and new beginnings, of family lost and found. The pale winter sun had barely risen over the snow-covered rooftops of Burlington when Lucas awoke on Christmas Eve. His stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as he thought about the day ahead. He had hardly slept, his mind replaying countless scenarios of how the split holiday celebrations might unfold. As he went through his morning routine, Lucas's gaze fell on the two carefully wrapped gifts on his dresser. One for his parents, a vintage first edition of his father's favorite novel that he had spent months tracking down. The other for Helena, a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover, along with a rare fountain pen he knew she would adore. The sight of the two presents side by side was a stark reminder of the delicate balance he was trying to strike. With a heavy sigh, Lucas gathered his things and headed out into the crisp Vermont morning. The drive to Helena's house was familiar now, but today it felt charged with an almost electric tension. As he pulled up to the Victorian home, Lucas could see warm light spilling from the windows and the silhouette of Helena moving about inside. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the front door. Helena answered his knock with a radiant smile, looking more vibrant than he had seen her in weeks. She wore an elegant emerald green dress that brought out the blue of her eyes, and her silver hair was styled in soft waves. "Merry Christmas, my dear," she said, pulling him into a warm embrace. The scent of her perfume, a mix of lavender and vanilla, enveloped him, stirring a complex swirl of emotions. As Lucas stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the transformation of Helena's home. The usual cluttered coziness had been replaced by a scene that could have been lifted straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The dining table was set with fine china and crystal, a sumptuous feast laid out upon it. "Helena, this is incredible," Lucas breathed, taking it all in. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she patted his arm. "Oh, but I wanted to. It's our first Christmas together, after all." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Their first Christmas as grandmother and grandson, yes, but also, perhaps, their last Christmas with the easy intimacy they had once shared. As they settled in to enjoy the meal Helena had prepared, Lucas found himself hyper-aware of every gesture, every word. He marveled at the little mannerisms he now recognized as his own. The way Helena tilted her head when she was listening intently, the small furrow between her brows when she concentrated on cutting her food. Their conversation flowed easily enough, touching on safe topics like Lucas's documentary progress and Helena's latest writing project. But underneath it all, Lucas could sense an undercurrent of something left unsaid. As they finished their main course, Helena reached across the table to refill Lucas's wine glass. Her hand trembled slightly, and Lucas found himself instinctively steadying it with his own. For a moment, they froze, the touch electric between them. "Helena," Lucas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I." But before he could continue, Helena pulled her hand away, a flash of pain crossing her features. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I'm being foolish. You should be getting ready to leave for your parents' house." Lucas felt his heart constrict. The clock on the mantel showed that it was indeed time for him to go if he wanted to make it to his family's traditional Christmas Eve gathering. But the thought of leaving Helena alone in this beautiful, lovingly prepared setting was almost unbearable. "I could stay," he found himself saying. "I could call my parents, explain." Helena's eyes widened in alarm. "No, Lucas, no, you mustn't do that. Your family, your parents, they need you too. What we have, it can't come at the expense of those relationships." Lucas knew she was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. As he stood to leave, gathering his coat and the gift he had brought for Helena, he felt as though he were being torn in two. At the door, Helena handed him a small, carefully wrapped package. "For your parents," she said softly. "A peace offering of sorts. You don't have to tell them it's from me if you don't want to." Lucas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. On impulse, he pulled Helena into a fierce hug, breathing in her familiar scent, trying to memorize the feeling of her in his arms. As he pulled away, he saw tears glistening in Helena's eyes. "Go," she said gently, cupping his cheek with one soft hand. "Be with your family. That's where you belong tonight." The drive to his parents' house was a blur, Lucas's mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He thought of Helena, alone in her beautifully decorated home, surrounded by the remnants of their Christmas dinner. He thought of his parents, waiting for him with decades of love and shared memories. As he walked up to his childhood home, the warmth of family traditions enveloping him, Lucas made a decision. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the years of separation and secrets, but he could choose how to move forward. That night, as his family gathered around the Christmas tree, Lucas stood up, his heart pounding. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "About Helena, about our family." And as the story poured out, as tears were shed and hugs exchanged, Lucas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would still be challenges ahead, still moments of awkwardness and pain. But it was a start. Later that night, as snow began to fall outside, Lucas sent a text to Helena. "Merry Christmas, Grandma. Thank you for the gift of truth. We'll figure this out together." As he hit send, Lucas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had made a sacrifice tonight, choosing family unity over his own conflicted feelings. But in doing so, he had opened the door to a future where all the pieces of his family, old and new, might finally come together. The harsh January wind whipped through the bare trees lining Burlington's snow-covered streets as Lucas made his way to Helena's Victorian home. His steps were heavy, his heart even more so. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, culminating in a bittersweet holiday season that had left everyone raw and exhausted. But nothing could have prepared Lucas for the phone call he'd received that morning. Helena was dying. The cancer had been a secret she'd kept from him, one final burden she'd chosen to bear alone. Now, it had progressed beyond treatment, and Helena had days, perhaps only hours, left. As Lucas approached the familiar porch, he noticed how the once cheerful Christmas wreath now seemed tragically out of place. He knocked softly, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The door opened to reveal a hospice nurse, her kind eyes filled with sympathy. "She's been asking for you?" the nurse said gently, ushering Lucas inside. The house that had once been so full of life and warmth now felt oppressively quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of medicines and the undeniable presence of impending loss. Lucas made his way up the creaking stairs, his feet carrying him to Helena's bedroom almost of their own accord. He paused in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Helena lay in her bed, looking impossibly small and fragile. Her silver hair, once so elegantly styled, lay limp against the pillow. But when she turned to look at him, her blue eyes still held that spark of intelligence and warmth that had captivated Lucas from the very beginning. "Lucas," she breathed, a weak smile spreading across her pale face. "You came." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, sinking into the chair beside her bed and taking her frail hand in his. "Of course I came," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm here, Helena. I'm right here." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, a lifetime of unspoken words passing between them. Then Helena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, "for keeping this from you, for all the secrets, all the lost time." Lucas shook his head, squeezing her hand gently. "No, Helena, no more apologies. We're past that now." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I need you to know," she continued, each word an effort, "that getting to know you these past months, it's been the greatest gift of my life. You've given an old woman a second chance at love, at family." Lucas felt his own tears begin to fall, hot and silent. "You've given me so much too, Helena. You've helped me understand myself, my history, in ways I never could have imagined." Helena's eyes drifted to the window, where fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. "I wish we had more time," she murmured. "There's so much more I wanted to share with you, so many stories left untold." Lucas followed her gaze, watching the snow transform the world outside into a blank canvas. An idea struck him suddenly, and he reached for his bag, pulling out his laptop. "Then tell me now," he said, opening a new document. "Whatever you want me to know, whatever you want to be remembered. I'll write it all down." And so, as the afternoon faded into evening and the room grew dark save for the soft glow of the laptop screen, Helena began to speak. She told Lucas of her childhood in Poland, of the simple joys and everyday struggles before the war tore her world apart. She spoke of her time in Auschwitz, not shying away from the horrors, but also sharing moments of unexpected kindness and resilience that had helped her survive. She told him about coming to America, about the overwhelming mix of hope and fear as she tried to build a new life. She spoke of meeting David, Lucas's grandfather, and of the love that had blossomed between them despite the weight of her past. And finally, with tears streaming down both their faces, she told Lucas about his father, about the impossible choice she had made to give him up, and the regret that had haunted her ever since. As the night wore on, Helena's voice grew weaker, but her spirit seemed to strengthen with each story shared. Lucas typed furiously, determined to capture every word, every nuance of her extraordinary life. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Helena's eyes fluttered closed. For a heart-stopping moment, Lucas thought she was gone. But then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, my darling boy," she whispered, "for listening, for understanding, for forgiving." Lucas set aside the laptop and leaned in close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Helena," he said, his voice breaking. "My grandmother, my friend." A small smile played at the corners of Helena's mouth. "And I love you, Lucas, more than you'll ever know." They sat in silence as the room slowly filled with the pale light of a winter morning. Lucas held Helena's hand, feeling her pulse grow weaker with each passing moment. And then, as quietly and peacefully as the snow falling outside, Helena took her final breath. Lucas sat there for a long time, his tears falling silently as he stroked Helena's hand. When he finally stood, he felt as though something fundamental had shifted within him. The confusing tangle of emotions that had defined their relationship, the inappropriate attraction, the shock of discovering their true connection, the pain of secrets revealed, all of it seemed to melt away, leaving behind a pure, unconditional love. As he gathered his things to leave, his gaze fell on the laptop where Helena's story now lived. He knew with sudden clarity what he needed to do. In the weeks that followed, as winter gradually gave way to spring, Lucas threw himself into a new project. He wove Helena's story, their story, into his documentary, creating a powerful narrative about family, forgiveness, and the enduring legacy of love. When the film premiered at a small independent theater in Burlington later that year, Lucas sat in the back row, tears streaming down his face as he watched Helena's life unfold on screen. And as the credits rolled and the audience rose in a standing ovation, he felt her presence beside him, warm and proud. In telling Helena's story, Lucas had found a way to keep her alive, to share her wisdom and her love with the world. It wasn't the future they had imagined when they first met in that grocery store so many months ago. But it was beautiful and it was real and it was theirs. As Lucas stepped out of the theater into the warm summer evening, he looked up at the stars twinkling overhead. "Thank you, Helena," he whispered, "for everything." And somewhere, in the vast tapestry of the universe, he could have sworn he heard her laughing. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.